Hello, I'm Peter. I'm so glad you could join me for tonight's journey. And if there's something weighing on your heart right now, big or small, I invite you to gently set it down here in the comments. You don't need to explain. Just give it a name. Work, loneliness, worry. Or simply drop an emoji if you'd rather leave it in silence. This way, you don't have to carry it alone. You're leaving it in a shared space where it can be seen and held safely. And for now, let your mind grow still and light. Let's begin together. Now, as you get comfortable, I want you to think about something for just a moment. When you imagine World War II, what comes to mind? The thunder of artillery, the roar of aircraft overhead, the clash of armies across muddy fields. Those images are real, certainly. But tonight, we're going to talk about a different kind of enemy. One that killed without firing a single shot. One that moved in silence, crept through clothing, and turned the human body against itself. Tonight's journey takes us to a forest in Belgium in the final winter of the war. To a place where the temperature became more dangerous than bullets. Tonight, I want to tell you about a young man named Elias. Much like many who stood in those woods, young men far from home who had to engineer their own survival from scraps of paper and handfuls of dirt. This is the story of how soldiers at Bastogne survived when their own supply system failed them, and how the warmth that saved them came not from equipment or technology, but from the quiet knowledge they shared with each other in the darkest hours. Let's drift back, now back through the decades to December 1944, to a cold that most of us wrapped in our warm beds tonight can barely imagine. The snow began falling on December 16, 1944, in a forest region of Belgium called the Ardennes. The landscape was a tapestry of somber whites and deep morning greens. Thousands of pine trees stood like silent frost-covered sentinels, their heavy boughs sagging under the weight of a snow that seemed to fall not from the sky, but from a void. The air carried a sharp metallic scent of ozone and frozen pine needles, a smell that bit at the nostrils and promised no mercy. Below the canopy, the forest floor was a graveyard of autumn leaves, now entombed in ice that cracked like bone under a heavy boot. Picture it for a moment. Dense woods of pine and oak, their branches already heavy with frost. Small villages tucked into valleys, their chimneys sending up thin trails of wood smoke. Roads that were barely more than muddy tracks winding between the trees. And scattered through this landscape, in hastily dug positions, thousands of American soldiers who believed this was the quiet sector, the place you went to rest after the hard fighting. Among them was a young private named Elias. He sat at the edge of his hole, his face a map of exhaustion. His skin, once bronzed by a summer in Georgia, had turned a translucent, ghostly pallor, mapped with fine red veins where the wind had whipped his cheeks raw. His eyes, sunken and shadowed with a deep violet hue, stared out from under a helmet that felt like a crown of ice. He wore the standard M1941 field jacket, a flimsy olive-drab shell that looked more like a summer windbreaker than a shield against a blizzard. It was stained with oil, and the dark, damp earth of the Ardennes, the fabric stiffening as the moisture within its fibers began to crystallize. They were wrong. At 5:30 that morning, in the darkness before dawn, the silence of the forest shattered. Not with the sound you might expect, but with something deeper, something that seemed to come from the earth itself. Over 1,000 German artillery pieces opened fire at once, and the percussion rolled through the valleys like thunder that wouldn't stop. The Battle of the Bulge had begun. But here's what the history books often miss. Yes, the German assault was massive. Yes, it caught the Allied forces by surprise. But in the weeks that followed, it wasn't German tanks or infantry that caused the most casualties. It was the cold. One soldier years later remembered it simply. "We marched through the night." He said, his voice still carrying the weight of that memory. "Snow cold up to your elbow. We didn't have no winter clothing or nothing. Oof. Cold place. Cold place." Two simple words for something that defied simple description. This wasn't the bracing chill of a winter morning. This wasn't the cold you felt waiting for a bus. This was a cold that went deeper than bone. A cold that the human body was never designed to withstand for days and weeks on end without shelter. The numbers tell part of the story. By the time the battle ended in late January, American forces had suffered approximately 105,000 casualties. Of those, 71,000 were due to the cold, not combat. The cold. Frostbite, trench foot, hypothermia conditions that were in the dry language of military medicine, largely preventable. But they weren't prevented. And that failure, that gap between what should have happened and what did happen, created a crisis that forced ordinary soldiers to become engineers of their own survival. Now you might be wondering, how could this happen? The United States had been at war for 3 years by this point. Surely they knew that Europe got cold in winter. Surely someone had thought to send warm clothing. Someone had thought of it. The problem was logistics, that unglamorous word that means getting the right supplies to the right place at the right time. And in December 1944, the logistics failed catastrophically. There was a jacket, the M1943 field jacket, designed specifically for cold weather. It had a wool liner, a windproof outer shell, all the features a soldier needed. Tens of thousands of them sat in warehouses in rear areas waiting to be distributed. But the front line had moved too fast. The supply chain couldn't keep up, and so those jackets stayed in their boxes while soldiers shivered in the thin M1941 field jacket, a garment designed for autumn weather, not the worst winter Europe had seen in half a century. The boots were even worse. The standard GI boot was a leather combat boot that laced up to the ankle. In theory, it was meant to be worn with 2 pairs of socks and then wrapped with wool leggings to keep the snow out. In practice, soldiers often laced their boots too tight, thinking it would keep their feet warmer. Instead, it cut off circulation. And when circulation fails in freezing temperatures, tissue begins to die. British soldiers fighting in the same forests just miles away suffered almost 0 cold weather casualties. The difference. Their supply system worked. They had proper winter boots with felt liners. They had wool greatcoats and extra layers. They had been drilled really in how to care for their feet in winter conditions. The Americans at Bastogne had hope, determination, and each other. In the beginning, that had to be enough. So there they were, thousands of young men, many of them barely out of their teens, standing in foxholes dug into frozen earth, wearing clothes designed for a different season entirely. The forest around them was beautiful in its way, the snow-muffled sound turning the world quiet and strange. Frost formed delicate patterns on the pine needles. In other circumstances, it might have been peaceful. But beauty and danger often walk hand in hand in winter. Every breath of wind that made the snow sparkle also drove the chill deeper. Every moment of stillness meant body heat bleeding away into the frozen ground. And every hour that passed without proper gear meant more soldiers silently crossing that invisible line between cold and hypothermia, between discomfort and genuine medical crisis. What happened next was remarkable, though, because when institutions fail, individuals adapt. When the supply system couldn't deliver what was needed, soldiers reached back into older knowledge, the kind of practical wisdom about cold that their fathers and grandfathers had known during the Great Depression, during those winters when keeping warm was a matter of survival, not comfort. They became without meaning to engineers, not with blueprints or laboratories, but with newspapers and straw and the simple physics of air and insulation. They built systems to keep themselves alive, using nothing but what they could find, steal or improvise. And those systems, crude as they were, worked well enough to see them through until relief came. This is their story. Not the story of generals or grand strategy, but the story of cold hands, learning to trap warmth of wet feet, taught to stay dry of bodies, discovering how to sleep in frozen earth without freezing themselves. It's the story of what happens when survival depends entirely on understanding, at the most basic level, how heat moves and how the human body loses it. Let's see what really happened when warmth became a weapon no one thought to supply. The foxholes were small universes of misery. Imagine yourself there for a moment if you can. You're 20 years old, maybe 22. 3 days ago, you were in a camp behind the lines, relatively warm, relatively safe. Then came the trucks in the middle of the night, the shouted orders, the long, cold ride through darkness. Now you're here, in a hole in the ground, about 6 feet long, maybe 2 feet wide, just deep enough that you can crouch below the surface. In the foxhole next to Elias sat Sergeant Miller. His beard was a thick, unruly thicket of ginger hair, now matted with frozen breath and greying with rime. He wore a wool scarf, a gift from a mother he hadn't seen in 2 years, wrapped so tightly around his neck that it hid his jaw. The scarf was a faded burgundy, the only splash of colour in a world of grey, and he clutched it as if it were a physical tether to his kitchen table back in Ohio. His hands, encased in wet wool gloves, were constantly moving, rubbing together with a dry, raspy sound like sandpaper. The hole itself is your work. You dug it yesterday, or maybe the day before, using an entrenching tool which is really just a small folding shovel. But digging in frozen ground is nothing like digging in summer earth. The surface is frozen hard, sometimes 6 inches deep. Your shovel bounces off it. Eventually, you learn to use the pointed end like a pickaxe, breaking the frozen crust, then scooping out the fragments underneath. It takes hours to dig a proper foxhole in ground like that. Hours of hard labor that leaves you sweating despite the cold. And that sweat cooling on your skin makes you even colder when you finally stop to rest. The physical toll was etched into their very beings. Their lips were cracked and bleeding, the blood freezing almost as soon as it emerged, forming tiny red rubies against their pale skin. Their knuckles were swollen and blue, the skin stretched tight and shiny. Mentally, they were adrift in a fog of cold tiredness. Their thoughts turned inward, dwelling on the phantom smells of Sunday roasts and the heavy, humid heat of a midsummer afternoon. They lived for the letters in their pockets, crumpled, salt-stained pieces of paper that smelled faintly of cheap perfume or old cedar chests. Elias would pull his out just to feel the texture, his fingers too numb to actually read the ink. Now the hole is dug and you're in it. The snow keeps falling soft and steady, the flakes, so thick sometimes you can barely see the trees 15 feet away. It gathers on your helmet, on your shoulders, in the folds of your too thin jacket. You brush it away, but more keeps coming, patient and relentless. Time moves differently in a foxhole in winter. Minutes stretch, hours blur together. You're supposed to stay alert, watching for movement in the trees, listening for the sound of engines or voices in German. But the cold makes concentration nearly impossible. Your mind wants to drift. Your body wants to curl up tight to conserve every bit of warmth. But you can't. You have to stay ready. The first thing you notice is your feet. They're cold, obviously, but it's more than that. At first, they ache a deep, throbbing ache that at least tells you there's still sensation, still blood flow. But as hours pass, the aching fades to numbness. Your toes feel thick and clumsy, like they belong to someone else. You try wiggling them inside your boots, but you're not sure they're actually moving. The numbness spreads up your feet to your ankles. It's insidious, this numbness. It doesn't hurt. It almost feels like relief, and that's exactly what makes it dangerous. The soldiers' boots, the Type II service shoes, were dark, waterlogged monuments to poor planning. The leather had turned a dull, bruised black from constant soaking and freezing. The laces, once sturdy cotton cords, were now frozen stiff like iron wires. If you looked closely at a soldier's ankles, you would see the skin was a sickly, mottled yellow-green, where the wet wool of the socks had pressed for days. There was no bounce left in their step. They moved with a heavy, flat-footed shuffle, their movements stiff and geriatric. Your hands are another problem. The army issued you wool gloves, but wool gloves are nearly useless for handling a rifle. The trigger guard is too small. You can't feel what you're doing. So most soldiers ended up taking off their gloves to handle their weapons. And in those moments, in seconds, really the cold attacked exposed skin with shocking speed. Fingers turned white, then red, then white again. The pain when it came was fierce, a burning sensation as feeling tried to return. Some men learned to tuck their hands under their armpits between tasks. Others tried to rotate one hand bare while one stayed gloved. Everyone developed their own small rituals, little negotiations with the cold. But your feet and hands were just the beginning. Cold attacks the whole body, working from the outside in. Your face, especially your nose and ears, burned and then numbed. Ice formed in your eyebrows if you were out long enough. Your breath froze in the air before you visible, even in darkness. And underneath it all, underneath the immediate discomfort of frozen extremities, your core temperature began its slow, dangerous decline. The military doctors had a term for this, though the soldiers didn't know it at the time. They called it environmental cold injury, a bloodless phrase for something that felt intensely, viscerally real. What's happening in simple terms is that your body is a heat engine burning calories to maintain a temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. But you're sitting still in a frozen hole, and heat radiates from your body in 3 ways simultaneously. First, there's conduction heat flowing directly from your body into whatever you're touching. The frozen ground beneath you is a perfect conductor, pulling warmth from your backside, your legs, anywhere you make contact. The wooden stock of your rifle becomes cold enough to hurt when you touch it. Think of conduction as the silent thief of the earth. It is the direct flow of your life's warmth into the frozen world you touch. When you sit on that icy ground, It does not just feel cold, it pulls. It reaches into your muscles, into your bones, and drinks your heat. Slowly, steadily, your heat leaves you to warm the earth that cannot be warmed. Conduction is the touch of the frost, a steady drain that never sleeps, pulling your life into the deep, dark ground. Second, there's convection heat, stolen by moving air. Every breath of wind, even gentle ones, carries heat away from any exposed skin. The phenomenon is real enough that it has a name: wind chill. A temperature of 20 degrees Fahrenheit feels much colder when the wind is blowing, because the moving air strips away the thin layer of warmer air that normally clings to your skin. Convection is the wind's cold hand. Every breath of air that moves past you isn't just air, it's a collector. It sweeps over your skin, picking up the thin, invisible layer of warmth you've worked so hard to create. The wind breathes on you, and as it passes, it carries a piece of you away. Again and again, the air moves. The air takes, and you are left with less. Listen to the wind. Feel it moving. Every movement is a theft. Every breeze is a thief carrying your warmth into the endless forest. Third, there's radiation, your body emitting heat as invisible infrared light, the same way a warm stove radiates heat into a room. This happens constantly, unavoidably. You can't turn it off. And in the open air of a foxhole with nothing to reflect that heat back to you, it simply vanishes into the night sky. Your body fights back, of course. It constricts blood vessels in your hands and feet, sacrificing your extremities to keep your core warm. It triggers shivering, rapid muscle contractions designed to generate heat. But shivering is exhausting, and you can only shiver for so long before your muscles fatigue. And all this desperate biological effort to stay warm requires fuel, calories, food. Which brings us to another problem. The Army's K rations. The little wax paper boxes of crackers, tinned meat and chocolate were calculated to provide about 3,000 calories per day. That's enough for a soldier doing moderate activity in moderate weather. But fighting in winter isn't moderate. Your body burns calories just trying to stay warm. Shivering alone can double your caloric needs. And the food in your K ration box, it's frozen solid. The chocolate could break your teeth. The cheese spread has the consistency of concrete. You can't eat frozen food, not really, and heating it requires fire, which you might not be able to risk. So you're cold, you're hungry, and you're stuck in a hole in the ground waiting. Waiting for orders, waiting for relief, waiting most immediately for your shift in the foxhole to end, so someone else can take over and you can retreat to whatever passed for warmth in the rear. But here's something that might surprise you. The soldiers at Bastogne, cold and miserable as they were, didn't break. They didn't abandon their positions. They held. And they held in large part because of something that doesn't show up in supply manifests or equipment lists. They held because they weren't alone. Every foxhole held at least 2 men, sometimes 3, if space allowed. And those men, complete strangers a few months before, became each other's lifeline. One man would stand watch while the other tried to rest curled at the bottom of the hole. Then they'd switch. They'd share body heat, sitting back to back, pooling their warmth. They'd share their rations, their cigarettes, their stories of home. They'd check each other's hands and feet for signs of frostbite, because sometimes you couldn't feel it yourself until it was too late. There's a phrase from that time, one you'll hear if you talk to veterans of the Ardennes. They talk about their foxhole buddy, not their commanding officer, not the great strategic picture. Their buddy, the guy next to them in the hole. The guy whose life depended on them staying alert and on whose alertness their own life depended. This is where the cold, as terrible as it was, began to reveal something unexpected. In civilian life, these men came from different worlds, different states, different backgrounds, different social classes. But in a foxhole in the Ardennes, those distinctions meant nothing. The cold didn't care if you were from a wealthy family or a poor one. It attacked everyone the same. And survival, real survival, meant helping each other. Not as a moral choice, though it was that too, but as a practical necessity. One veteran described it years later, his voice soft with something that might have been wonder. "I never knew a man could care so much about another man's feet," he said. But there we were, checking each other's boots every few hours, making sure the other guy wasn't getting trench foot. I knew the condition of his toes better than my own. The cold was relentless. Yes, the cold was the enemy. But the cold in its own terrible way was also the thing that showed these men what they were capable of. Not just endurance, though, there was plenty of that, but genuine care. The kind of care that kept you checking on someone else, even when you could barely feel your own fingers. The kind that made you give up your dry socks because your buddy's feet were worse off than yours. This was the frozen front line. A place of suffering, certainly, but also a place where the mathematics of survival created bonds stronger than anything these men had known before. And those bonds, as we'll see, mattered more than any equipment could. There's a particular kind of cold that comes not from the temperature itself, but from the sinking realization that you don't have what you need. That's what the soldiers at Bastogne felt when they looked down at their own uniforms and then across at their British counterparts. The British troops fighting in the same forests sometimes just a few miles away might as well have been dressed for a different war. They wore greatcoats, those long wool coats that fell almost to the knee-line and heavy. Underneath layers of wool shirts, wool trousers, wool long underwear. On their feet, boots designed specifically for winter with removable felt liners that could be dried separately. And over everything, if needed, white camouflage smocks for blending into the snow. The Americans had their M1941 field jacket. To be fair to the jacket, it wasn't a bad garment for what it was designed to do. In autumn, weather say 40 or 50 degrees with moderate activity, it worked fine. It was a waist-length jacket made of cotton twill with a light wool lining. It had pockets, a drawstring at the waist to keep wind out and button front closure. For October or early November, it was adequate. But this was late December, and the temperature at night was dropping well below freezing, sometimes into the teens or single digits Fahrenheit. The M1941 simply wasn't built for that. The cotton twill outer shell wasn't windproof. Air could flow through the weave of the fabric, carrying heat away from the body. The wool lining was thin, maybe a quarter-inch thick at most, nothing like the heavy wool of British greatcoats. And because the jacket was short, it left the hips and thighs exposed, covered only by equally thin cotton trousers. There's a physics principle at work here that soldiers learned through bitter experience. Insulation works by trapping air, and the thickness of the trapped air layer determines how well it insulates. A quarter-inch of wool can trap some air, but not much. The cold simply conducts through it. You need multiple inches of insulating material to create enough dead airspace to slow heat loss significantly. The British had that. The Americans didn't. The boots were an even more glaring problem, and they caused more casualties than any piece of equipment in the theatre. The standard American combat boot, called the Type II service shoe, was a leather boot that came up to the ankle, maybe an inch or two above. It laced up the front with cotton laces. In dry weather on firm ground, they were decent boots. But they had a fatal flaw. They were designed to be worn with the laces pulled tight. Elias remembered his father's old work boots, thick-soled and greased with mink oil to keep the Tennessee rain out. These army boots were nothing like that. They were fashionable by comparison, sleek, thin-walled, and utterly porous. By the fourth day, the leather was no longer leather. It was a cold, wet sponge that held the ice against his skin. He looked at his buddy's feet, and the sight was haunting. The laces were buried in a crust of frozen slush, and the leather had swollen, mimicking the shape of the dying feet inside. Every soldier had been taught to lace his boots snugly to prevent blisters and provide ankle support during marches. That training made perfect sense in normal conditions. But in freezing weather, tight lacing became a death sentence for your feet. Here's why. Your feet rely on blood flow to stay warm. Blood carries heat from your core to your extremities. But blood vessels are delicate, soft structures that compress easily. When you lace your boots tight, especially around the ankle and in step, you compress those blood vessels. Blood flow decreases. Less blood means less heat delivery. And in cold weather, reduced circulation means your feet start to freeze, even though the rest of your body might still be relatively warm. The condition has a name, trench foot, though it's also called immersion foot in medical literature. It was first widely documented in World War I in the trenches of France and Belgium, the same region where these soldiers were now fighting. The mechanism is simple and terrible. When feet are kept cold and damp for extended periods, blood vessels constrict to preserve core heat. But extreme or prolonged constriction damages the vessels themselves. Tissue begins to die, even though it hasn't actually frozen. The damage can be permanent. In severe cases, amputation is the only option. British medical officers had studied trench foot exhaustively after the First World War. They developed protocols: keep feet dry, change socks daily, never lace boots tight in cold weather, inspect feet regularly. And they'd designed boots with these lessons in mind. Their winter boots had looser fits, removable liners, and they trained their troops obsessively about foot care. The Americans had the research. They had access to the same medical knowledge. But somehow, in the chaos of rapid deployment and stretched supply lines, that knowledge didn't translate into action. Soldiers arrived at the front with the boots they had, with the training they'd received for different conditions, and no clear guidance on how to adapt. One soldier interviewed decades later remembered the exact moment he realized something was wrong. "I'd been in my foxhole maybe 8 hours," he said. "My feet were cold, yeah, but I figured that was just how it was. Then I tried to stand up for my watch, and I couldn't feel the ground. My feet were completely numb. I looked down, and my boots were still laced up tight, just like they taught us in basic. I didn't know that was the problem. Nobody told us." By the time medical officers started seeing the results, trench foot cases were flooding the aid stations. Feet swollen to twice their normal size, skin mottled purple and grey blisters forming, as circulation tried to return. Some men would never walk normally again. Many lost toes. A few lost entire feet. And here's the most bitter part: it was preventable. Not with complex medical interventions or expensive equipment, but with simple knowledge. Loosen your laces, change your socks, take your boots off for a few minutes every few hours to let blood flow return. These were things men could have done for themselves if only someone had told them. The contrast with British forces was stark, and for American commanders deeply embarrassing. British units fighting in identical conditions reported trench foot rates close to 0. Not because their men were tougher or more resistant, but because their system worked. Information flowed from medical officers to field commanders to the men in foxholes. Equipment matched conditions. Training addressed the specific threats. The Americans would learn these lessons, but they learned them slowly through casualties that didn't need to happen. And in the meantime, soldiers did what soldiers always do when institutions fail them. They improvised. Because while the army might not have sent them adequate jackets or taught them proper boot protocol, it had sent them something else. Something that turned out to be more valuable than anyone realized. It had sent them the ability to think, to observe, to adapt. And it had sent them in groups so that knowledge could spread from one man to another, one foxhole to the next, creating a kind of grassroots education in survival. The gap between what they had and what they needed became the space where ingenuity lived. And that ingenuity, as we'll see, drew on wells of knowledge, deeper than military training, reaching back to memories of the Depression, to grandfathers who'd survived winters without central heating, to a whole tradition of making do with less that most of these young men carried somewhere in their bones. Sometimes the worst kind of cold is the kind that comes from knowing warmth exists somewhere just out of reach. The M1943 field jacket, the one that should have been on every soldier's back in December 1944, was a beautiful piece of engineering. Combat Quartermaster Corps had worked with textile experts to design it specifically for cold weather warfare. It had a tight weave cotton sateen outer shell that was genuinely windproof. The wool liner was thick, almost an inch of dense fabric, and it could be buttoned in or removed depending on the temperature. There was a wool knit collar that could be turned up to protect the neck. The pockets were placed to allow access even when wearing a cartridge belt. It extended lower than the M1941, providing protection for the hips and upper thighs. In every measurable way, it was exactly what soldiers in the Ardennes needed. And tens of thousands of them sat in warehouses in Antwerp and other rear area depots waiting. While the front lines shivered, the rear depots were cathedrals of wasted warmth. Stacked high in dark, dry warehouses, the crates of M1943 jackets smelled of new wool and mothballs. Each jacket was crisp, its buttons gleaming, its lining soft and expectant. Outside these depots, the rear echelon troops moved with a casual warmth, their cheeks rosy, their movements fluid. They wore the jackets that belonged to the men in the holds, and the bitterness this created was a coldness of the soul that no fire could touch. The failure here wasn't one of design or manufacturing. It was logistics, that unglamorous science of getting things from where they are to where they're needed. And in the winter of 1944, the logistical system of the Allied armies was stretched to its absolute breaking point. Let's understand what had happened in the months before the Battle of the Bulge. After the breakout from Normandy in August Allied forces had advanced at a pace that surprised everyone, including themselves. They'd liberated Paris. They'd driven across France. By September, they were at the German border, sometimes pushing forward 20 or 30 miles in a single day. It was exhilarating. It felt like the war might end by Christmas. But armies don't run on enthusiasm. They run on fuel, ammunition, food, and in winter, warm clothing. And all of those supplies had to come from the coast, from the beaches of Normandy, or from captured ports, travelling hundreds of miles over roads that were often little more than cart tracks, in trucks that were wearing out from constant use. The supply officers had a name for this problem, the Red Ball Express, the priority trucking route that was supposed to keep frontline units supplied. At its peak, the Red Ball Express was running over 6,000 trucks, driven 20 hours a day, burning through tires and engines at unsustainable rates just to keep enough supplies flowing. And even then, it wasn't enough. Priorities had to be set. Ammunition came first, then fuel, then food, then, if there was space left, everything else. Winter clothing was everything else. The M1943 jackets had been manufactured. They'd been shipped across the Atlantic. They'd been unloaded at ports. They'd even made it to forward depots. But they sat there in their packing crates, while trucks carried ammunition and gasoline to the front instead. The calculation was simple and brutal. You could send a truck loaded with jackets, or you could send a truck loaded with artillery shells. The shells would save more lives, at least in the short term, so the shells went first. Except that calculation turned out to be wrong. Because while artillery shells might stop a German attack, they didn't stop the cold. And the cold, as we've seen, was causing casualties at a rate that eventually surpassed combat itself. Men who couldn't fight because their feet were frozen were just as unavailable as men who'd been wounded by shellfire. In some ways, they were worse because cold injuries incapacitated men, slowly, quietly creating a steady drain on combat effectiveness that wasn't immediately obvious. The soldiers knew the jackets existed. Word had gotten around. Some men had seen them in rear areas, had watched supply clerks wearing M1943s, while the combat troops still shivered in M1941s. That knowledge was corrosive. It bred a particular kind of resentment, the feeling that someone somewhere in the chain of command had decided they didn't matter enough. One sergeant described his feelings in a letter home that he wrote months after the battle. "We knew they had better gear," he wrote. "We'd heard about it. But it was always coming soon or on the next supply run. After a while, you stop believing. You stop trusting that anyone higher up actually cares if you freeze. You start thinking, maybe you're just not important enough to deserve warm clothes. That's a hard thing to carry, knowing you're cold, because somebody made a choice, and the choice wasn't you. The distribution delays weren't malicious. Nobody was deliberately withholding equipment out of cruelty. But the effect on morale was the same as if they had been. And morale, that intangible quality of whether soldiers believe their leadership cares about them, matters enormously in combat. It's the difference between men who fight because they're ordered to, and men who fight because they believe in what they're doing and trust that their sacrifice isn't being wasted. The delays also created a cruel irony. While American soldiers shivered at Bastogne, German soldiers fighting against them often had better winter equipment. Not because German logistics were superior, they weren't, but because the German army had been fighting in Russia for 3 years. They'd learned through horrific casualties in the winter of 1941 What happens when you send troops into winter combat without proper clothing? By 1944, even as Germany's war economy was collapsing, winter clothing remained a priority. German soldiers at the Bulge had heavy overcoats, felt boots, wool gloves, even white camouflage suits. So you had situations where American soldiers were stripping coats from German dead, or prisoners not as trophies, but as necessities. A captured German overcoat could make the difference between surviving the night comfortably and developing hypothermia. Field manuals might have forbidden taking enemy equipment, but field manuals didn't keep you warm. Survival did. The distribution problem extended beyond just jackets. Wool socks, for instance, were critical for preventing trench foot, but they were also chronically short. The recommended protocol was to change socks daily, keeping at least one pair dry at all times. But if you only had the 2 pairs, you had been issued weeks ago, and both were soaked. The protocol was useless. Extra blankets were in short supply. Sleeping bags, the cold weather type with wool filling, barely existed in the forward areas. What finally broke the logjam was casualties. By late December, the trench foot and frostbite rates were so high that they began affecting operational capability. Whole units were losing combat effectiveness, not from battle, but from cold. Medical evacuation channels were clogged with men whose feet had frozen. The hospitals behind the lines were full. At that point, finally, the supply priority changed. Trucks that had been carrying ammunition started carrying clothing. The M1943 jackets began reaching frontline units. Wool socks arrived by the crate. Boots with felt liners, the type British soldiers had been wearing all along, started to appear. By January, the distribution system had mostly caught up. But January was too late for thousands of men. The damage was done. Toes had been lost. Feet had been amputated. Some soldiers would walk with a limp for the rest of their lives, all because a jacket that existed in November didn't reach them until January. There's a lesson in this that goes beyond military history. Systems, even well-intentioned ones, can fail people in catastrophic ways simply through delay. And when systems fail, the people at the sharp end, the ones who actually need the resources, bear the cost. They can't wait for the system to fix itself. They have to find another way. And that's exactly what the soldiers at Bastogne did. They stopped waiting for the institutional solution and created their own. Your body is a furnace, though you probably don't think of it that way. Right now, as you listen to these words, maybe lying in bed or sitting in a comfortable chair, your body is burning fuel, converting food into energy and releasing that energy as heat. About 100 watts of power, roughly the same as a dim light bulb, radiating from your skin into the air around you. In a normal room at normal temperatures, this heat loss is perfectly balanced by the heat you generate, and you feel comfortable. For a soldier in the Ardennes, this furnace was flickering. His skin was no longer a barrier, but a leaking sieve. Underneath the thin layers of cotton, the tiny hairs on his arms stood on end, a primal, useless attempt to trap air. His heart, a tireless engine, labored to pump thickening blood through narrowing vessels. To look at a man in the depths of this drain was to see someone being erased. His features became sharpened, the skin pulling tight over the cheekbones, the nose turning a waxy, translucent white. In his pocket, Sergeant Miller kept a letter from his wife Sarah. He would pull it out and read it by the dim light of a hooded flashlight. The paper was soft, the edges curled from the moisture of his own breath. "The fireplace is crackling tonight," she wrote, and the house smells of cinnamon and pine. He would close his eyes and try to summon that smell, but all he could scent was the iron-cold air and the faint, sweet rot of the frozen forest. His spirit was a candle in a gale flickering lower with every hour of the sunless day. But change the environment, make it cold enough, and that balance breaks. You keep losing heat at the same rate or faster, but you can't generate enough to replace it. And when that happens, when the math of heat loss exceeds heat production, your body begins a series of desperate compensating mechanisms, each one more costly than the last. The soldiers at Bastogne learned these mechanisms intimately, though they didn't know the scientific terms. They just knew what it felt like when their bodies started losing the fight against cold. It begins at your skin. Human skin, under normal conditions, sits at about 91 degrees Fahrenheit, a few degrees cooler than your core temperature of 98.6. But skin temperature is flexible. It changes based on blood flow. When you're cold, blood vessels in your skin constrict, reducing flow to the surface. This is your body's first line of defense, a way of creating an insulating layer by letting your skin get colder while keeping your core warm. As your skin cools, it becomes a less effective radiator of heat. There's less temperature difference between your skin and the air, so less heat flows out. It's a clever adaptation, and it works up to a point. But there's a cost. Reduced blood flow to the skin means reduced blood flow to your hands and feet, your ears and nose, all the extremities that are already vulnerable. And that's where frostbite begins. Frostbite is exactly what it sounds like. Tissue freezes. Water inside cells turns to ice crystals, and those crystals tear cell membranes apart. The damage can be permanent. But before you get to actual freezing, there's a condition called frostnip, where tissue gets cold enough to lose sensation, but not cold enough to freeze. Frostnip is reversible. Warm the tissue gently, and function returns. The problem is, when you're sitting in a foxhole for hours, you can't always tell the difference between frostnip and frostbite until it's too late. One medic described the progression in clinical terms, though his voice carried the weight of having seen it too many times. First, the skin goes white, he said. Bloodless. Then it might get red as the soldier tries to warm it, rubbing or blowing on it. Then, if it's really frozen, it goes hard, waxy looking. At that point, the tissue's dead. We'd see men come in and their fingers would be grey, completely grey, and we'd know there was nothing to do but wait for the tissue to rot off or amputate before infection set in. But frostbite, terrible as it was, wasn't the only way cold attacked. There was also the slower, more insidious process of whole body heat loss. Remember those three mechanisms I mentioned before: conduction, convection, and radiation. They're always working, always pulling heat from your body. And in a foxhole in winter, each one becomes a serious problem. Conduction happens through direct contact. Your body touches cold earth and heat flows from the warmer object you to the colder object the ground. The rate of heat flow depends on the temperature difference and on what material you're in contact with. Earth is actually a pretty good conductor, better than air, much better than wood. When you sit or lie on frozen ground, heat drains from your body at a frightening rate. You can lose core body temperature just from ground contact, even if the air itself isn't that cold. Think of conduction as the silent thief of the earth. It is the direct flow of your life's warmth into the frozen world you touch. When you sit on that icy ground, it does not just feel cold, it pulls. It reaches into your muscles, into your bones, and drinks your heat. Slowly, steadily, your heat leaves you to warm the earth that cannot be warmed. Conduction is the touch of the frost, a steady drain that never sleeps, pulling your life into the deep, dark ground. The soldiers didn't know the physics, but they knew the feeling. You could sit in a foxhole for an hour, one veteran remembered, and the cold would just creep up from the ground, up through your backside, into your guts. It felt like the earth itself was sucking the life out of you. And no matter how you shifted position, you couldn't get away from it, because the whole floor of the hole was frozen. Convection is heat loss to moving air. Even gentle breezes, the kind you barely notice in summer, become dangerous in winter. Air movement keeps bringing fresh, cold air into contact with your skin, stripping away the thin layer of warm air that would otherwise cling to you. This is why wind chill exists. A temperature of 20 degrees with no wind feels very different from 20 degrees with a 15-mile-per-hour wind. The temperature is the same, but the rate of heat loss is much higher. Convection is the wind's cold hand. Every breath of air that moves past you isn't just air, it's a collector. It sweeps over your skin, picking up the thin, invisible layer of warmth you've worked so hard to create. The wind breathes on you, and as it passes, it carries a piece of you away. Again and again, the air moves. The air takes, and you are left with less. Listen to the wind. Feel it moving. Every movement is a theft. Every breeze is a thief carrying your warmth into the endless forest. Foxholes offered some protection from wind, at least direct wind, but they weren't sealed bunkers. Air moved through them, especially at night when temperature differences created convection currents. Cold air, being denser, would sink into the bottom of the foxhole, while any warm air generated by body heat would rise and escape. You were sitting in a pocket of the coldest air, and it constantly refreshed itself. Radiation is the most invisible of the three, and in some ways the hardest to defend against. All warm objects emit infrared radiation. You can't see it, but it's there, carrying energy away from your body at the speed of light. In a room, walls and other objects absorb that radiation and re-emit their own, creating a kind of balance. But in an open foxhole, your radiation just escapes into the sky. The night sky, especially on clear nights, is effectively a huge cold sink, absorbing all the heat you radiate and giving nothing back. Radiation is the most mysterious thief of all. Even in total stillness, even without touching a thing, you are glowing. Not with light you can see, but with infrared heat shining out into the void of the night sky. Like a fading coal in a dark room, you are shining your heat away into the stars. It leaves you at the speed of light, traveling up into the blackness, never to return. You are a star fading in the cold. You are radiating your essence into the infinite dark, fading, cooling, shining into the void. Soldiers would sometimes rig tarps or ponchos over their foxholes, partly for camouflage, but partly to create a barrier that would reflect some of that radiant heat back down. It helped, but not much. The cold was patient and relentless. Now your body can compensate for moderate heat loss. You shiver, generating heat through muscle activity. You increase your metabolic rate, burning calories faster. You might even feel hungry, your body's signal that it needs more fuel to keep the furnace going. But all of these compensations have limits. Shivering can only last so long before muscles fatigue. Increasing metabolism only works if you have food to burn, and many soldiers were on reduced rations. And eventually, if heat loss continues, your core temperature begins to drop. Not just your skin, but your actual internal temperature. Hypothermia sets in stages. Mild hypothermia core temperature around 95 degrees causes shivering and confusion. You feel cold, obviously, but you can still function. Moderate hypothermia, 90 to 95 degrees, brings worse confusion, slurred speech, loss of coordination. Your brain isn't getting enough warmth to work properly. Severe hypothermia below 90 degrees is life-threatening. Heart rate slows. Breathing becomes shallow. Eventually, cardiac arrest. The terrible thing about hypothermia is that it impairs judgment right when good judgment is most critical. A soldier starting to slide into hypothermia might not realize it. He might make decisions that seem logical to his cold, addled brain, but are actually dangerous. He might decide to leave his foxhole to find warmth, exposing himself to enemy fire. He might take off his jacket because hypothermia can create a false sensation of warmth in its final stages. His foxhole buddy might be the only thing standing between him and death, the only person who can recognize the signs and intervene. This is the physics of dying from cold. It's not dramatic. There's no single moment of crisis. It's just math heat flowing out faster than it's being replaced until the equation tilts too far and the body can't come back. But here's where human ingenuity enters the picture. Because once you understand the mechanisms of heat loss, once you understand that it's conduction and convection and radiation doing the damage, you can start to engineer solutions. You can't change the laws of physics, but you can work within them. You can find ways to slow conduction, to block convection, to reflect radiation back where it's needed. And that's exactly what the soldiers did, using materials that the army never intended as cold weather gear, but which worked because the physics didn't care about intentions. It only cared about trapped air and temperature gradients, and the simple fact that some materials conduct heat more slowly than others. Sometimes the most valuable things are the ones you were about to throw away. In the supply trucks that came up to the front along with ammunition and food, there was always paper. Newspapers mostly printed back in the States or in England, and shipped over to give soldiers some connection to home. These weren't front-page news. By the time a newspaper made it from New York or London to a foxhole in Belgium, it was weeks out of date. But that didn't matter. Soldiers read them anyway, hungry for any word from beyond the war, any reminder that there was still a world out there where people worried about baseball scores and movie reviews instead of artillery barrages. The stars and stripes arrived like a message from a forgotten planet. The pages were grey and grainy, filled with ink that smudged against frozen fingers. They contained news of a world that felt impossibly far away. Yanks win doubleheader. New film at the Roxy. Housewives adjust to sugar rationing. To a man in a frozen hole, these stories were like fairy tales from a golden age. When you finished reading, the paper protocol said to dispose of it properly. But proper disposal in a combat zone is a loose concept at best. Most soldiers just crumpled up the paper and tossed it aside, or burned it for a moment's warmth, or used it for other necessary purposes. The paper was trash. In other words, garbage. Nothing of value. Until someone, and history hasn't preserved his name, realized that crumpled newspaper was actually something extraordinary. It was insulation. Elias watched as Miller took a page of the Stars and Stripes and began to crumple it. The sound was sharp, like 1,000 dry leaves breaking at once. He stuffed the wad of paper inside his jacket over his chest, then another and another. Soon, Miller looked bloated. His chest unnaturally square, his jacket strained at the seams. But his eyes, for the first time in days, his eyes looked focused. "It's the air, kid." Miller whispered, his voice a raspy croak. "The air don't move in the paper. It stays warm." They became a strange army of papermen. As they moved, they made a dry rustling sound, a soft shuck-shuck that replaced the clink of gear. Beneath their jackets, the news of the world was literally keeping them alive. A headline about the Brooklyn Dodgers was pressed against a shivering heart. An advertisement for a new Cadillac was wrapped around a freezing thigh. It was a bizarre Hawaii co-union of the home front, and the battlefront a physical layer of home, protecting them from the here. Think about what newspaper is physically. It's thin sheets of paper, but when you crumple it, you create a lattice of small air pockets. Air trapped and still is one of the best insulators known to physics. It's why fiberglass insulation works, why down feathers keep birds warm, why double-paned windows are better than single panes. Air doesn't conduct heat well, and if you can trap it so it doesn't move, you create a barrier that heat has trouble crossing. Crumpled newspaper traps air beautifully. Each crumple creates dozens of small pockets. The paper itself provides structure, keeping the air from circulating and carrying heat away through convection. And newspaper is light, easy to stuff into clothing, easy to replace when it gets wet. The technique spread the way useful information always spreads in armies, not through official channels, but through whispered conversations and direct observation. One soldier stuffs newspaper inside his jacket and finds he's warmer. His foxhole buddy notices and asks about it. The technique passes to the next foxhole and the next. Within days, half the company is doing it. Within a week, it's standard practice. They stuffed newspaper inside their jackets, layering it between their undershirt and the wool liner. They stuffed it inside their trouser legs, padding their thighs and chins. They even stuffed it inside their boots, though that required removing the boots first, and removing boots in extreme cold was its own risk. The effect was immediate and remarkable. Soldiers who'd been shivering uncontrollably found that they could get warm, or at least stop getting colder. The newspaper created an extra inch or two of insulation, which doesn't sound like much, but in terms of heat retention, it was the difference between survivable cold and hypothermia-inducing cold. One soldier described the feeling in a letter home. "It's strange," he wrote, "but you put some newspaper inside your coat and suddenly you feel human again. It's not that you're warm exactly, but you stop feeling like the cold is eating you from the inside out. It's like putting on armor, but armor against the weather instead of bullets." There's a beautiful physics lesson hidden in this simple adaptation. What matters for insulation isn't the material itself, but the thickness of the still air layer it creates. You could achieve the same effect with wool, but wool was in short supply. Newspaper was abundant. And crucially, newspaper could be replaced. When it got wet from sweat or snowmelt, you could pull it out, throw it away and stuff in fresh, dry paper. Wool once wet took hours to dry and was much less effective when damp. The technique wasn't perfect, of course. Newspaper is fragile. It tears easily. If you moved too vigorously, the paper would compress and lose its air pockets, reducing its insulating value. and it did nothing for the problem of conduction from the ground or radiation to the sky. But it solved the convection problem, stopping wind from blowing heat away from your torso, and that alone was enough to make a life-saving difference. There's a deeper story here too, one about knowledge and where it comes from. The soldiers who invented the newspaper technique weren't engineering students. They hadn't studied thermodynamics, but many of them had grown up during the Great Depression in houses that didn't have central heating, in families that couldn't always afford coal for the stove. They'd learned as children the folk wisdom of staying warm in winter. Stuff your coat with whatever you have. Layer everything. Keep moving to generate heat, but not so much that you sweat. This was knowledge passed down from parents and grandparents' knowledge that had no official status, but which worked. When the army's supply system failed them, these men reached back into that older knowledge and found solutions that the army, with all its resources and expertise, hadn't provided. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important knowledge isn't written in manuals. It's carried in memory, in the accumulated experience of ordinary people who faced hard winters before and found ways to survive. The newspaper technique became so ubiquitous that it appeared in official after-action reports. Army investigators studying why casualty rates improved in January, even though the cold continued, noted the widespread use of improvised insulation. Some officers tried to formalize it, to issue paper specifically for this purpose. But by then, the war was moving on, and the M1943 jackets were finally arriving in numbers. The need for newspaper stuffing diminished. But for those weeks at Bastogne, when the temperature dropped below freezing and the wind cut through thin cotton newspapers, saved lives. Not because they were designed to, but because soldiers understood at a basic intuitive level what cold was and how to fight it. They might not have known the words thermal conductivity or convective heat transfer, but they knew that air held still was warm, and that was enough. It's one of those small miracles of wartime improvisation. A thing with no military value, yesterday's news printed on cheap paper became a survival tool. It's a reminder that value isn't inherent in objects. Value emerges from context, from need, from human creativity in the face of necessity. And sometimes the most valuable thing you own is the thing you almost threw away. If you've ever lain on frozen ground, even for a few minutes, you know the sensation. The cold doesn't just touch you, it pulls at you. It drains heat from your body so efficiently that you can feel yourself getting colder with every passing second. Now imagine lying on that ground for hours, for a whole night, for days on end. The floor of the foxhole was a mirror of the sky, a dark, crystalline expanse of frozen mud. To touch it with a bare hand was to feel a burn as intense as fire. The ground didn't just feel like earth. It felt like a hungry, ancient entity that wanted to swallow the heat of the living. Elias saw a buddy try to sleep on the bare ground. By morning, the man's side was as cold as a slab of beef in a butcher's window, his movements slow and jerky like a rusted clockwork toy. They turned to the forest. They scavenged for pine branches, the needles dark and sharp-smelling of a deep, resinous life that the winter couldn't kill. They found straw in the ruins of a collapsed barn, gold dry, and smelling of sun-drenched summers in the Belgian countryside. They layered these materials into a thick, springy mattress. When Elias finally lay down on a bed of pine and straw, it felt like luxury. The scent of the crushed needles rose up, intoxicating and sharp, a wild perfume that masked the smell of unwashed bodies and war. That was the reality of foxhole life. The floor of your fighting position wasn't optional. You couldn't levitate above it. You had to make contact with the frozen earth, and that contact was stealing your warmth, your energy, your ability to survive. The soldiers needed something, anything, to break that connection. A layer between them and the ground that would slow the conductive heat transfer, that would give their bodies a fighting chance to maintain core temperature. And once again, they found their solution, not in military supply, but in the natural world around them. Straw became gold. Pine branches became treasure. Dry leaves, previously just forest litter, became sought-after commodities. The technique was simple. Before settling into your foxhole for any length of time, you gathered organic material and spread it on the floor. Straw was best if you could find it stolen from barn lofts in abandoned farmhouses or pulled from haystacks in frozen fields. Straw is hollow each stem, a tiny tube filled with air, and when you pile it up, those air-filled tubes create a thick insulating layer. It's the same principle as crumpled newspaper, but straw is more durable and holds its structure better under weight. If you couldn't find straw, pine branches worked almost as well. The needles stayed on even when the branches were cut, and a thick mat of pine boughs created enough airspace to provide meaningful insulation. Soldiers would venture out of their foxholes in relatively quiet periods, moving quietly through the forest, cutting branches with their knives, or even breaking them by hand, then dragging them back and layering them carefully in the bottom of the hole. One soldier described the process with the kind of detail that suggests he'd done it many times. "You want about 6 inches of material if you can manage it," he said. "Start with the bigger branches on the bottom, then layer smaller stuff on top, kind of weaving it together so it doesn't compress too much when you put your weight on it. Takes maybe 20 minutes to gather enough if you're near trees. But those 20 minutes, they pay you back in hours of being able to rest without your back going numb." The improvement was dramatic. A soldier lying directly on frozen earth might lose enough core heat in a few hours to become dangerously hypothermic. But with a 6-inch layer of pine boughs beneath him, that same soldier could sleep actual sleep and wake up cold, but functional. The physics at work here is conduction, which we talked about before, but it's worth understanding in detail. Heat flows through materials at different rates. Metals conduct heat very quickly, which is why a metal spoon in hot coffee gets hot all the way up the handle. Wood conducts heat more slowly. Air, if it's not moving, barely conducts heat at all. Frozen earth conducts heat moderately well. Not as fast as metal, but much faster than air. When your body touches frozen ground, you create a temperature gradient. Your skin at 91 degrees, the ground at 20 degrees, and heat flows down that gradient from warm to cold, until eventually the ground directly under you warms up a little and you cool down a lot. But if you put organic material between you and the ground, you interrupt that direct contact. Heat now has to flow through your body into the straw or branches, through the air pockets within the material, and only then into the ground. Each step slows the transfer. The air pockets especially act as bottlenecks. Heat moves through them so slowly that it's almost like having a warm layer beneath you instead of a cold one. There's a practical limit, of course. Make the layer too thick and it becomes unstable. You sink into it, compressing the air pockets, reducing effectiveness. Too thin and it doesn't provide enough insulation. 6 inches seemed to be the sweet spot, thick enough to work, but manageable enough to gather and maintain. The technique had an unexpected benefit as well. The organic material absorbed moisture. Foxholes were damp places, especially when snow fell and then partially melted from body heat or rare sunshine. That moisture had to go somewhere, and if it soaked into your uniform, you were in serious trouble. Wet clothing loses almost all its insulating value. But straw and pine needles could absorb a surprising amount of water, keeping it away from fabric and skin. When the material got too wet, you could pull it out, toss it aside, and replace it with fresh, dry material. Some soldiers got even more creative. They'd make small woven mats from branches, essentially building a rudimentary platform to lie on. Others would use their shelter halves, the small individual tarpaulins that could be buttoned together to make a tent as ground cloths, then layer organic material on top of that. The tarp prevented moisture from wicking up from the earth, while the organic layer provided insulation. This kind of knowledge, like the newspaper trick, wasn't written in any field manual. It was folk wisdom, the kind of thing that anyone who'd camped in winter or slept rough during hard times would know instinctively. But it had to be rediscovered by young men who'd mostly grown up with houses and beds and floors that didn't freeze. The sharing of this knowledge became its own kind of survival mechanism. An experienced soldier, one who'd learned the hard way to gather materials before settling in, would pass that knowledge to newer arrivals. "Get yourself some boughs before you try to sleep," he'd say, and the new soldier would look at him confused until he spent one night on bare ground and understood immediately. There was even a kind of camaraderie in gathering materials. Soldiers would work in pairs, one keeping watch, while the other ventured a short distance to collect pine branches or straw. They'd share what they found, making sure everyone in the squad had enough. In some ways, this was more valuable than ammunition or food, because ammunition didn't matter if you were too hypothermic to pull a trigger, and food didn't help if you were too cold to digest it. The ground barrier wasn't glamorous. It didn't feature in heroic stories or official citations, but it was essential, a small innovation that made survival possible, that allowed soldiers to rest their bodies without losing their lives to the cold earth beneath them. And it was achieved with nothing but materials that had always been there, waiting in the forest, free for the taking if you knew to look. The foxhole, that simple hole in the ground, became a problem to solve. Not just a place to fight from, but a miniature engineering challenge. The earth of the Ardennes was a fickle mistress. In the valleys, the clay was a heavy slate-grey mass, cold and unyielding as iron. When they struck it with their shovels, it didn't crumble. It fractured into jagged razor-sharp plates. But higher up, the chalk was a brilliant, blinding white. It was soft, almost like dry bread, but it left a ghostly dust on their uniforms and faces. A soldier coming out of a chalk hole looked like a spectre, his eyebrows and eyelashes coated in fine white powder, his eyes peering out from a mask of ancient stone. They learned to read the dirt like their grandfathers read the weather. They looked for the warm spots where the frost hadn't penetrated deep. They learned that the earth beneath the frost was a living thing, darker, richer, and carrying a faint, musty heat. To dig into that deeper soil was to find a secret. Elias dug until he reached the damp, chocolate-brown earth 3 feet down. He pressed his palm against it. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't killing cold. It was the temperature of a root cellar, a stable, quiet place that knew nothing of the blizzard above. How do you make a hole in frozen earth not just defensible, but livable? How do you turn a depression in the ground into something that provides genuine protection from the cold as well as from enemy fire? The answer, it turned out, involved thinking about soil not just as dirt, but as a material with properties that could be exploited or mitigated. Soldiers at Bastogne encountered two main soil types. In the valleys and lower areas, they found clay dense and moisture-rich, the kind of soil that sticks to your shovel and turns slippery when wet. On higher ground and near rock outcrops, they found chalk, a softer limestone that was easier to dig when not frozen, but had its own challenges. Clay was treacherous. When frozen, it was nearly impenetrable. Your shovel would bounce off it, sending shockwaves up your arms, maybe even breaking the wooden handle if you struck too hard. You had to chip at it, almost like mining, breaking off small chunks at a time. But once you got through the frozen crust, maybe 6 inches deep, the clay underneath was merely very hard rather than impossible. The problem with clay was water. Clay holds moisture. It doesn't drain. So any water that got into a clay foxhole from melting snow or condensation from breath and body heat stayed there. It pooled at the bottom. It soaked into your boots, your trouser cuffs, anything that made contact with the floor. And wet feet, as we've discussed, were the fast track to trench foot. Chalk was different. It was easier to dig even when frozen because it was softer, more brittle. You could make progress with a shovel in chalk even in cold weather, though it still took hours of hard work to dig a proper hole. The advantage of chalk was drainage. Water percolated through it, disappearing into the porous rock below instead of pooling. A chalk foxhole stayed relatively dry, which was an enormous advantage. But chalk had a different problem. It was white, conspicuously, obviously white. When you dug into chalk, you created a scar in the landscape that was visible from the air. German observation planes, flying reconnaissance when weather permitted, could spot fresh foxhole positions from the white gouges in the earth. This made chalk holes dangerous, at least until they could be camouflaged with branches or snow. The soldiers learned to read the ground before they dug. In areas where they had a choice of position, they'd choose chalk over clay, accepting the need for better camouflage in exchange for drier conditions. In clay areas, they developed techniques to manage moisture, digging small drainage channels that led to sumps away from the sleeping area, or lining the floor with extra layers of organic material to absorb water. But there was another property of soil that soldiers learned to exploit, one that's less obvious but equally important. The earth below the frozen surface layer maintains a relatively stable temperature year-round. In the Ardennes in winter, while the air temperature might drop to 15 or 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the ground just a few feet down stays around 45 to 50 degrees. Not warm certainly, but dramatically warmer than the air. This is geothermal stability, the fact that deep soil is insulated from surface temperature swings by all the soil above it. And it means that if you dig deep enough, you start to encounter ground that's not frozen ground, that's actually a source of relative warmth compared to the frigid air. The standard foxhole was about 4 feet deep enough to crouch below the surface, but not much more. But some soldiers, those with time and energy and the right soil conditions, went deeper. They dug what were essentially underground chambers, excavations that went down 5 or 6 feet, and then expanded outward, creating a space that was entered through a narrow vertical shaft, but which opened into a larger room below ground level. These weren't common. They took days to dig, and most positions didn't last that long before units moved or the tactical situation changed. But where they existed, these deep positions were dramatically warmer than surface foxholes. The earth itself acted as insulation, buffering the inhabitants from the worst of the cold. Soldiers could sleep in these deep holes without layering every scrap of material they owned, could rest without the constant shivering that exhausted muscles and burned calories. The technique required skill, though. Dig too deep in certain soils, and you risked collapse. The sides of the excavation had to be stable, which usually meant digging in clay or firm chalk, not in sandy or crumbly soil. You also had to manage moisture differently. Water still accumulated, but in a deep hole, it couldn't be easily drained to the surface. Some soldiers dug sumps in the corners, small pits that collected water and kept it away from the living space. Ventilation became important in deep holes too. When you have multiple soldiers in an underground chamber, all breathing, all generating carbon dioxide and moisture, the air can become stale and damp. Some positions had crude ventilation shafts, small tunnels angled up to the surface that allowed fresh air in while still providing overhead protection. There's a historical precedent for this kind of engineering, one that some of the older soldiers might have known about. During World War I, in the same region of France and Belgium, soldiers had dug elaborate trench systems that included deep dugouts, underground shelters that could house entire platoons. The Germans especially had developed this into an art with dugouts that had bunks, tables, even small stoves. The techniques weren't secret. They were documented in military engineering manuals. But most American soldiers in World War II hadn't been trained in this kind of construction. They had to rediscover it or learn from veterans who'd heard stories from their fathers. The soil layering technique also involved thinking about air itself as something you could manage. The deepest, coldest air, being denser, would settle at the bottom of any depression. If you made your sleeping platform slightly elevated, even just a few inches on a pile of branches, you'd be above that cold air pool sleeping in slightly warmer air. It's a small difference, maybe a degree or two, but a degree or two could mean the difference between adequate rest and teeth-chattering exhaustion. Some positions evolved into small underground communities. 2 or 3 connected foxholes with tunnels between them, allowing soldiers to move without exposing themselves to surface observation or fire. These mini-tunnel systems provided mutual support and shared warmth. Multiple bodies in connected chambers generated more heat, raising the overall temperature of the space by several degrees. The engineering wasn't formal. No one was calculating thermal conductivity or soil compressive strength. But the soldiers were doing engineering. Nonetheless, real engineering, the kind that starts with observation and proceeds through trial and error to solutions that work. They noticed that deeper was warmer. They noticed that certain soils held up better than others. They noticed that raised platforms slept warmer than floor level. And they shared these observations, building a collective expertise that no individual could have developed alone. By late December, the more experienced units had the foxhole positions that were almost comfortable, as strange as that sounds. Not warm, never truly warm, but livable. Places where a man could get actual sleep, could maintain his strength, and alertness could survive not just for a day or two, but for weeks, if necessary. And that collective knowledge that grassroots engineering meant that when the German attacks came, when the siege tightened and ammunition ran low, and the cold deepened, the Americans could hold. Because they'd solved the problem of the ground beneath them. They'd turned Earth from an enemy into an ally, or at least into neutral territory. And in a battle where every advantage mattered, where survival itself was an achievement that was everything. There's a kind of safety in being underground that goes beyond physical protection. It's psychological, ancestral even. The cave, the burrow, the shelter beneath the earth, where the wind can't reach you, and the cold, if it's still present, is at least diminished. These palaces of dirt were marvels of desperate architecture. The soldiers used logs from shattered oaks, their bark rough and blackened by artillery fire, to roof their chambers. They covered the logs with a foot of earth, then a layer of snow to blend into the landscape. Inside, the world changed. The howling of the wind became a muffled, distant moan. The air turned thick and heavy, smelling of damp wool earth and the faint, sweet scent of a Coleman stove burning. In one of these bunkers, 4 men sat in a circle. The light of a single candle stuck in a tin of rations cast long, flickering shadows against the earthen walls. Their faces were etched with deep lines of weariness, but in the golden light, they looked like something out of an old painting, Rembrandt's soldiers in a cavern of ice. They shared a single letter from a girl named Martha back in Kansas. It was written on pale blue paper, the handwriting elegant and flowing. "I'm keeping your chair by the window," it said. "The cat still sleeps on your old sweater." They passed the letter around each man, touching the paper, as if it could transmit the warmth of Martha's house across the Atlantic. The soldiers at Bastogne, without quite realizing it, were tapping into this ancient human impulse when they began building more elaborate underground positions. The most sophisticated of these were the winter bunkers, though that's perhaps too grand a term for what were essentially enlarged foxholes with overhead protection. But compared to a simple hole in the ground, they were palaces. The construction started with the standard foxhole technique. Dig down 4 feet, 5 feet as deep as soil conditions allowed. But instead of stopping there, instead of just creating a vertical shaft to crouch in, the builders would begin excavating horizontally, hollowing out a chamber in the earth itself. This required the right kind of soil. Clay worked best for this, ironically. The same clay that was miserable for standard foxholes, with its moisture retention and its frozen surface, was actually ideal for larger excavations because it held its shape. Clay has cohesion. Dig a cavity in clay, and the walls support themselves at least for a while. You didn't need timber supports or shoring, though those helped if you could scavenge the materials. The resulting chamber might be 6 feet long, 4 feet wide, just tall enough to sit up in if you hunched. The entrance would be a narrow shaft, maybe 2 feet square that you'd slide down into. This design had defensive advantages. An enemy would have to expose themselves at the entrance to attack, and only one at a time. But the real benefit was thermal. Underground chambers, especially those below the frost line, maintained temperatures significantly higher than surface air. The earth itself acted as insulation, buffering the interior from the extreme cold above. Soldiers sleeping in these chambers reported interior temperatures that could reach into the 40s Fahrenheit, or even low 50s if enough men were present, and the chamber was well sealed. That's still cold by normal standards, but compared to surface temperatures in the teens and 20s, it felt almost balmy. The thermal mass of the Earth is enormous. Once you're surrounded by soil, you're benefiting from the heat stored in millions of tons of dirt. That heat diffuses very slowly, meaning the ground temperature stays relatively stable even as surface conditions swing wildly. It's the same principle that keeps caves at a constant temperature year-round, cool in summer and relatively warm in winter. Some soldiers understood this intuitively. Others learned it by accident, digging for protection and discovering warmth as a bonus. But word spread, and where tactical conditions allowed where the front was stable enough that men had time to dig these underground havens multiplied. The most ambitious example from the period, though not from Bastogne itself, was the Franja Partisan Hospital in Slovenia mentioned earlier. While American soldiers were digging enlarged foxholes, Slovenian partisans were constructing an entire underground medical facility in a mountain gorge hidden from German observation by the steep cliffs and thick forest. Franja wasn't a single bunker, but a complex of 14 wooden cabins built on platforms along a ravine, connected by wooden walkways and hidden under camouflage netting and natural foliage. What made it remarkable was its persistence. From December 1943 until May 1945, it treated over 500 wounded fighters from multiple nations and was never discovered by German forces despite being in occupied territory. The thermal management at Franja was more sophisticated than anything possible in a foxhole. The cabins were insulated with whatever materials could be scavenged. Small stoves burned wood gathered from the surrounding forest. The ravine itself provided natural shelter from wind, and the sound of the stream running through it masked noise. But the basic principle was the same as the foxhole bunkers: use the earth and the landscape to create a microenvironment more favorable than the open air. Back at Bastogne, the underground positions couldn't match Franja's sophistication, but they incorporated similar ideas. Overhead cover was critical. Logs scavenged from destroyed buildings or cut from the forest would be laid across the top of the chamber, then covered with a foot or two of soil. This created a roof that provided both protection from artillery and an additional layer of thermal insulation. The entrance shaft could be partially covered with a tarp or shelter, half creating an airlock of sorts. This prevented wind from blowing directly into the chamber and allowed the build-up of warmer air inside. Some positions even had crude doors boards or pieces of metal that could be pulled over the entrance, leaving just a small gap for ventilation. Inside the chamber, the organization followed a logic dictated by physics and necessity. The sleeping area would be at the highest point in the chamber where warmer air accumulated. Equipment and supplies would be stored lower down in the colder zones. If there was a small stove, and some positions did have improvised stoves made from tin cans or scavenged metal, it would be positioned to vent through a small chimney hole while providing maximum heat to the occupants. The stoves themselves were ingenious. The Coleman stove mentioned in military accounts was particularly valued because it could burn almost any liquid fuel, gasoline, kerosene, even diesel in a pinch. Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent, called it the second most important piece of equipment in the European theatre, right after the Jeep. In an underground bunker, even a small stove making minimal heat made a huge difference, raising the temperature from dangerously cold to merely uncomfortable. But fire brought its own risks. Carbon monoxide poisoning was a real danger in enclosed spaces. Soldiers had to maintain ventilation, which meant accepting some heat loss through the ventilation shaft. It was a balance, enough fresh air to breathe safely, but not so much that you lost all the warmth you'd worked so hard to generate. The underground havens also became social spaces. In a standard foxhole, you might share the position with one other man, your buddy. But in a larger chamber, 3 or 4 or even 5 men could gather. This allowed for better rotation of watch duties. It allowed for the pooling of resources, shared food, and heat and companionship. And crucially, it allowed for collective warmth. Human bodies generate heat continuously, about 100 watts per person, as mentioned before. 5 people in an enclosed space are generating 500 watts, the equivalent of a small space heater. If that heat is trapped by good insulation and not carried away by wind, it accumulates, raising the ambient temperature of the space. Soldiers sleeping in groups in chambers with good overhead cover and minimal air leakage could create genuinely warm conditions, relatively speaking. There's something almost medieval about these underground chambers. They echo the dugouts and earthworks of earlier centuries, the shelters that armies have been building since the invention of siege warfare. But they also represent adaptation, the willingness to learn from the environment and from each other, to take techniques that worked in other contexts and apply them to current needs. By mid-January, when the siege of Bastogne was finally broken, and relief forces broke through the landscape around the town was honeycombed with these positions. Not every unit had them. Not every soldier had time or energy or the right soil to build them. But where they existed, they were lifesavers literally. Men who might have died from hypothermia in surface foxholes survived in underground chambers. Men who might have lost toes to frostbite kept their feet because they could sleep in relative warmth. The chambers were temporary, of course. When the battle moved on, when the front shifted and the soldiers advanced or withdrew, the chambers were abandoned. Over time, they collapsed or were filled in. Today, if you walk through the forests near Bastogne, you can still find depressions in the ground, subtle irregularities that mark where these positions once were. They're not monuments. There are no plaques. But they're evidence remnants of the engineering that kept men alive in one of the hardest winters of the war. In the end, no amount of engineering or improvised insulation could fully compensate for poor choices about how you used your body. Survival in extreme cold required not just equipment, but discipline, a set of behaviors that had to be maintained constantly, even when exhausted, even when every instinct screamed to just stop moving and curl up tight. The most critical of these behaviors involved your feet. We've talked about trench foot before, but it's worth understanding the prevention in detail, because this was where discipline mattered most. The protocol was simple in theory. Check your feet regularly, keep them as dry as possible, and maintain circulation. In practice, in a foxhole under fire, or during a long, cold night, when removing your boots seemed like an invitation to disaster, the protocol was hard to follow. But the soldiers who survived learned to follow it anyway. They developed rituals, small routines that became as automatic as breathing. Every few hours, if the tactical situation allowed, you'd remove your boots. Just for a few minutes. You'd examine your feet, looking for the telltale signs of cold injury skin that had gone white or grey loss of sensation swelling. You'd massage your feet, forcing blood back into the capillaries, warming the tissue with friction and movement. If your socks were wet, you'd change them. Dry socks were precious, so you'd wring out the wet ones and tuck them inside your jacket against your skin where body heat would dry them for the next change. Your feet would go into the dry socks, then back into the boots. But this time, you'd lace them loosely, deliberately, leaving room for blood to flow. The buddy system was essential here. It's hard to be disciplined about your own feet when you're exhausted and cold and just want to sleep. But if your buddy was checking his feet, you'd check yours too. If he reminded you it was time for a sock change, you'd do it even if you didn't want to. Mutual accountability. The kind that came from knowing your buddy's survival depended on you and yours on him. Enforced a discipline that self-regulation alone couldn't maintain. There were other behavioral disciplines too. Hydration, for instance, was critically important but counterintuitive. In summer heat, everyone knows to drink water. But in cold weather, especially when the water in your canteen is frozen solid, drinking seems optional. It's not. Dehydration in cold weather happens faster than most people realize through breath vapor and through the body's attempt to maintain core temperature. And dehydration makes hypothermia worse, reducing blood volume and making it harder for the body to distribute heat effectively. The solution was to keep your canteen close to your body inside your jacket if possible, using body heat to prevent freezing, or to melt snow. Though that required care, eating snow directly can actually cool your core, so it's better to melt it first, even if that just means holding it in your mouth until it liquefies. Food discipline mattered too. The body needs calories to generate heat, so eating regularly even when you didn't feel hungry was crucial. The problem was that the K rations were frozen. But there were ways to deal with that. You could tuck a chocolate bar inside your jacket, warming it enough to be edible. You could share a can of cheese between multiple people, taking turns hacking off frozen chunks with a knife. You could, if you had fire, heat the cans, though that risked burning your mouth on superheated metal. Some soldiers became experts at using the Coleman stove, the multi-fuel burner that could heat food or water with just a few ounces of fuel. The stove was simple, a metal base with a burner head, a pump to pressurize the fuel tank, and a valve to control the flame. But it required technique. Too much pressure and the flame would be huge and wasteful. Too little and it wouldn't burn hot enough. Learning to dial in the perfect flame to heat a can of rations without scorching it became a skill worth learning. Movement discipline was perhaps the hardest. When you're cold, the temptation is to move constantly to generate heat through activity. And movement does help up to a point. But excessive movement makes you sweat, and sweat is death in cold weather. Moisture in your clothing destroys insulation, conducting heat away from your body at a frightening rate. You had to learn the balance enough movement to maintain circulation and morale, but not so much that you soaked your undershirt. The soldiers developed small exercises they could do in a foxhole. Isometric contractions, tensing muscles without large movements. Toe wiggles and ankle rotations to keep blood moving in the feet. Hand clenches to keep fingers flexible. These weren't officially taught, but they spread through observation and conversation, becoming part of the informal curriculum of survival. Sleep discipline was crucial but difficult. You needed sleep to function, to make good decisions, to avoid the mental fog that hypothermia could induce. But sleeping in a foxhole was dangerous. If you slept too long in one position, especially lying directly on cold ground, you could wake up hypothermic, or with frostbitten patches on whatever body part had been in contact with the earth. The solution was to sleep in shifts never more than an hour or two at a time, and to sleep on your layered insulation of straw or pine boughs. Some soldiers slept sitting up, leaning against the wall of the foxhole, minimizing ground contact. Others slept curled in fetal position, conserving heat. But everyone learned to wake up periodically, to check their extremities, to move around enough to keep blood flowing. There was also the discipline of not doing certain things, which was sometimes harder than doing them. For instance, alcohol. There were officers who issued rum rations in cold weather, thinking it would warm the men. But alcohol is a double-edged sword in cold. It causes vasodilation, opening blood vessels in the skin, which creates a sensation of warmth, but actually increases heat loss. You feel warmer while getting colder, a dangerous combination. The soldiers who understood this, either through education or through observing what happened to those who drank heavily in the cold, avoided alcohol or used it sparingly. Similarly, there was the discipline of not taking unnecessary risks. In severe cold, a small injury could become a major problem. A cut that would be minor in warm weather could refuse to heal in the cold, becoming infected. A sprained ankle could be career-ending if it meant you couldn't move enough to stay warm. So soldiers learned to move carefully to avoid unnecessary chances to treat their bodies like the fragile heat-generating machines they were. The behavioral disciplines weren't heroic. They weren't the kind of thing that makes exciting stories, but they were effective. The difference between a soldier who maintained these disciplines and one who didn't was often the difference between walking out of Bastogne on your own feet, or being carried out on a stretcher, or not coming out at all. And here's the remarkable thing. These disciplines were largely self-taught, passed peer to peer, enforced by buddy checks and squad-level culture, rather than by officers and regulations. The army had foot care protocols in its manuals, but the manuals were written for different conditions and didn't always translate well to the reality of foxholes in Belgium in December. So the soldiers adapted, combining official doctrine with folk wisdom and their own observations, creating a practical knowledge base that was more effective than what had been taught in training. This is resilience in its purest form. Not just enduring hardship, but learning from it, adapting to it, developing the behaviors and habits that turn survival from a matter of luck into a matter of skill. The soldiers at Bastogne became experts in cold weather survival, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And that expertise, bought at such a high cost, saved countless lives. There's a moment that many soldiers remembered years later when someone asked them about Bastogne. Not the battles, not the fear or the danger, but the cold. And what they remembered more than anything else was the warmth of another human being. The buddy system was official doctrine, but what happened in the foxholes went beyond what any manual described. Two men, maybe strangers before the war, maybe from different backgrounds entirely, would find themselves in a hole together, responsible for each other's survival. And in the crucible of that shared ordeal, something profound happened. The warmth started as purely physical. On the coldest nights, when the temperature dropped to its lowest, and the wind found every gap in clothing, the men would huddle together, back to back, at first sharing the heat that radiated from their cores. The contact was awkward, initially intimate, in a way that made some men uncomfortable. American culture didn't encourage physical closeness between men, but discomfort was temporary. Hypothermia was permanent. So they learned to set aside that discomfort. they'd sit pressed together or lie side by side, or even sleep with one man curled around the other like spoons in a drawer, sharing blankets, sharing body heat, pooling their warmth in a way that allowed both to survive when either alone might not have. The physics is straightforward. Two bodies in close contact create a shared thermal envelope. Heat radiating from one person warms the other, and vice versa. The total heat loss from the pair is less than the sum of what each would lose individually, because less surface area is exposed to cold air. It's the same principle that makes huddled penguins or sleeping puppies warmer than isolated individuals. But the warmth that mattered most wasn't physical. It was psychological, emotional. A warmth of the spirit that came from knowing you weren't alone. In the darkness of a winter foxhole with the enemy somewhere out there in the trees and the cold pressing in from all sides, the presence of another person became more than just a source of heat. It was a tether to humanity, a reminder that you mattered to someone, that your survival was important to someone else. The conversations in foxholes ranged from mundane to profound. Talk about home, about family, about what you do after the war. Sharing photos worn and creased of sweethearts or mothers or children. Telling stories, funny ones or sad ones, just to pass the time and keep the mind occupied with something other than cold and fear. One veteran described it simply: "My buddy and I, we weren't friends before. Hell, I didn't even like him much at first. He was from New York, talked fast, talked a lot. I was from Iowa, didn't have much to say. But after 3 days in that hole together, checking each other's feet, sharing our last chocolate bar, sleeping back to back, I knew him better than I knew my own brother. And I knew he wouldn't let me freeze. That knowledge, that trust it, was better than a warm coat. It kept you going when everything else told you to quit." The buddy system also distributed the cognitive load of survival. When you're cold and exhausted, your judgment deteriorates. You might forget to check your feet, or think it's fine to sleep a little longer, or decide that the symptoms you're feeling aren't serious. But your buddy, watching you with clearer eyes, could catch those mistakes. He could notice that your speech was slurring, a sign of hypothermia. He could see that you were shivering too hard, or not shivering at all, both danger signs. He could insist that you eat something, drink something, move around, even when you didn't want to. And you'd do the same for him. It was a mutual support system, resilient, because it was decentralized. No officer had to order it. No sergeant had to enforce it. It happened organically because survival demanded it, and because humans at their core are social creatures who care for those close to them. The shared warmth also eroded social barriers that would have seemed immovable in civilian life. In that foxhole, it didn't matter if you were college-educated or hadn't finished high school. It didn't matter if your family had money or if you'd grown up poor. The cold didn't discriminate, and neither did survival. An officer and an enlisted man sharing a foxhole would share warmth the same way. Class distinctions melted in the face of a common enemy. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, but widely repeated among veterans, of a battalion commander who spent a night in a frontline foxhole sharing space with 2 privates. The privates didn't recognize him at first in the darkness, and by the time they did, it didn't seem to matter. They slept in a pile like everyone else, officers and enlisted men, indistinguishable, united by the need to survive the night. In the morning, the colonel thanked them for the warmth and moved on. No report was filed, no orders were given. But the story spread, and it mattered, because it confirmed what the men in the foxholes already knew. In the face of that kind of cold, everyone was equal. This equality, this forced intimacy, created bonds that lasted lifetimes. Veterans of Bastogne formed associations. After the war, held reunions stayed in touch across decades. They'd gather and tell stories, and many of those stories came back to the foxholes, to the nights when survival meant holding on to each other, to the trust that developed when your life depended on another person and his on you. The warmth they shared in those foxholes became a kind of gold standard for friendship. Many veterans would say later in life that they never felt closer to anyone than they did to their foxhole buddy, even closer than to spouses or children. Not because they loved their families less, but because the intensity of shared hardship created a bond that peacetime life couldn't replicate. This is what the cold revealed. Not just the ingenuity of using newspaper for insulation or pine boughs for ground barriers, but the capacity of human beings to care for each other, to share warmth when warmth is scarce, to find connection in the most brutal circumstances. The shared warmth was also a form of resistance. The cold was impersonal, mechanical, a force that sought to reduce body temperature below the threshold of survival. But the human warmth, the physical and emotional closeness of the buddy system was personal. It was a choice. It was an assertion that survival wasn't just about maintaining core temperature, but about maintaining humanity, connection, dignity. When the siege of Bastogne finally ended, when relief forces broke through and the immediate crisis passed, the soldiers emerged changed. They'd learned technical skills about insulation and heat transfer, certainly. But more importantly, they'd learned about each other and about themselves. They'd learned that warmth, real warmth, the kind that matters when everything else has been stripped away, doesn't come from equipment or institutions. It comes from the decision to care for another person, to share what little you have, to refuse to let your buddy freeze, even if it means discomfort or sacrifice. That lesson, more than any other, is what the survivors carried with them for the rest of their lives. Not the memory of cold, though that stayed with them too, but the memory of warmth, of being held by another human being, in the darkest hours of being told through action, rather than words, that you mattered, that you weren't expendable, that someone would fight to keep you alive. And perhaps that's the final lesson of Bastogne. The cold was real. The hardship was real. The suffering and death were real. But so was the warmth. So was the care. So was the human capacity to find light in darkness, to create connection in isolation, to turn survival into something more than just not dying. So there they were, the soldiers at Bastogne, in the final days of December 1944 and into January 1945. The relief forces arrived on the 26th of December, breaking the siege, though the fighting continued for weeks more. The weather eventually broke too cold, giving way to the slow thaw of late winter. The immediate crisis passed, but the lessons remained. Those soldiers, the ones who survived, carried with them a knowledge that couldn't be written in manuals. They knew in their bones what cold really was and how to fight it. They knew the value of crumpled newspaper, of pine boughs, laid carefully in the bottom of a hole of buddy checks and shared warmth. They knew that survival often came down to small decisions, made moment by moment, and that those decisions required discipline and mutual care. When army investigators arrived in the spring to study what had happened, They interviewed survivors, examined casualty reports, walked the ground. Their findings were clinical, as military reports tend to be. They noted the failure of the supply system to deliver adequate winter clothing. They documented the trench foot casualties, the frostbite amputations, the hypothermia deaths. They made recommendations: better cold weather training, improved boot design, faster distribution of seasonal equipment. Those recommendations led to changes. The military learned in its slow institutional way. Future soldiers would benefit from that learning. But the report could never fully capture what had actually happened in those foxholes. The grassroots innovation, the peer-to-peer knowledge, transfer the profound human connections forged in shared hardship. The veterans themselves rarely talked about it, at least not in the immediate aftermath. There's a peculiar reticence that comes after extreme experiences, a sense that people who weren't there couldn't possibly understand. So why try to explain? They came home, tried to resume normal lives, found that normal didn't quite fit anymore. But as years passed, some of them did start to talk, to write memoirs, to give interviews. And when they talked about Bastogne, about that terrible winter, they almost always came back to the same themes: the cold, the ingenuity born of desperation, the buddies who kept them alive, the warmth that mattered most. There's a parallel story to Bastogne, one that existed simultaneously in a different part of Europe, but carried similar lessons. The Franja Partisan Hospital in Slovenia, that hidden medical facility in the mountain gorge, operated through the entire winter of 1944-1945. Like the soldiers at Bastogne, the partisans and medical staff at Franja survived through improvisation, through using the earth itself as shelter, through collective effort and mutual support. Franja treated 522 patients from multiple nations. They performed surgeries in wooden cabins heated by small stoves. They kept wounded men alive through the winter, using techniques and equipment that would have been laughable in any proper hospital. But they succeeded, and they succeeded for the same reasons the soldiers at Bastogne succeeded: ingenuity, discipline, and human warmth. After the war, Franja became a museum, a preserved site where you can still see the wooden cabins, the surgical tools, the narrow beds where wounded fighters recovered. It's a monument in its quiet way to the same kind of survival that happened at Bastogne. Different context, different armies, but the same human capacity to endure. The story of winter survival at Bastogne is ultimately a story about what happens when systems fail and individuals have to save themselves. The equipment didn't arrive. The training wasn't adequate. The strategic planning hadn't accounted for the worst winter in generations. All the institutional supports that soldiers should have been able to rely on fell short. But the soldiers didn't fall short. They adapted. They learned. They shared knowledge. They helped each other. And they survived, not in spite of the institutional failures, but by replacing institutional support with something more primal and arguably more reliable human cooperation born of necessity. Crumpled paper became insulation because someone noticed that trapped air was warm. Pine boughs became bedding because someone remembered that separation from frozen ground meant survival. Deep underground chambers became sanctuaries because someone understood, even without the vocabulary to explain it, that the earth stores heat. The buddy system worked because humans are social creatures who in extremis care for each other. These weren't revelations. Every piece of knowledge, every technique had antecedents in human history. People had been staying warm in winter for thousands of years before Bastogne. But each generation has to learn those lessons anew, or remember them when they're needed. The soldiers at Bastogne did that remembering. They reached back into folk wisdom, into Depression-era improvisation, into the accumulated knowledge of how to survive when resources are scarce and the cold is relentless. And they lived. Not all of them. Casualties were high from combat and from cold, but far more lived than would have if they'd waited passively for warmth to be delivered to them. They engineered their own survival, and in doing so, they demonstrated something important about human resilience. The warmth that mattered most didn't come from gear or technology. It came from the soldiers who knew that staying alive meant sticking together. From the man who checked his buddy's feet, even though his own were numb. From the man who shared his dry socks, even though he only had one pair. From the man who gave up his spot in the warm part of the foxhole so someone else could rest. From every small act of care that accumulated into something larger than any individual could achieve alone. This is the legacy of Bastogne. Not just the tactical victory, though, that mattered. Not just the famous reply of "nuts" to the German surrender demand, though that's remembered. But the quieter, deeper legacy of men discovering their capacity for survival and for caring for, using intelligence and cooperation to overcome conditions that should have killed them. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your warm bed, think for a moment about those men in their frozen foxholes. Think about the cold they endured and the warmth they created. Think about the ingenuity of crumpled newspaper and the profound simplicity of sharing body heat. Think about what it means to survive, not just as individuals, but as communities, not through superior equipment, but through mutual support. Their story isn't just history. It's a reminder of what we're capable of when we have to be when systems fail, and we have to rely on each other and on our own creativity. It's a reminder that warmth, real warmth, comes not from things, but from people, from connection, from care. If you found value in tonight's journey, I hope you'll consider sharing it with someone who might appreciate these stories of quiet resilience. And if you want to explore more about how warrior cultures faced extreme conditions with minimal resources, I'd love to have you join me for my episode on how the Vikings managed waste on open boats without getting sick. Their solution was simple but ingenious, much like the techniques we've explored tonight. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment below with your location and what time it is in your world. It's always remarkable to me how this community spans so many different places and time zones, all connected by these stories from the past. Sleep well wherever you are. Stay warm. And remember that the greatest warmth often comes, not from what we have, but from who we're with and how we care for each other. Good night.